Hello. Another 3 months has passed in the blink of an eye, so I'm here to tell you about the last 3 months of my reading. So I'll be talking about the stats, I'll be talking about my favourite books that I've read in these 3 months, and I'll also be talking about whether I'm meeting my reading goals for this year. So let's start with the stats. In my Q1 wrap-up, I looked at how many books I've read from my own shelves, from the library and through ARC, and then compared that with how many ended up in my favourites books and also how many books I DNFed from each of those categories as well. And I think I'm going to do that again today. So in total, I read 31 books in these 3 months and DNFed 5 books. So 8 of the 31 books I read were non-fiction, which means that I'm still averaging about 25% non-fiction and 75% fiction, which I am quite happy with. So how many books have I reduced my own TBR by? 21 books I read from my own shelves. 3 of those books I DNF'd. 5 of the remaining 18 books ended up in my top reads list, which I will tell you about in a minute. So then moving on to the library, I read 11 books from the library and 1 of them I DNF'd. So of the 10 that I did finish, 6 of them ended up in my top reads list. And then ARCs, I read 3 ARCs in these 3 months, with 1 of them being a DNF and 1 of them being in my top reads list. Hello, I'm just going to take a quick moment to tell you about my online print sales. I'm an analogue photographer who prefers experimental and abstract work. In my online shop, you can find carefully sourced colour prints on gorgeous paper stock that looks like watercolour paper, and also my homemade darkroom prints. The colour prints are £15 each and the darkroom prints are £25. If you're watching this within the month of July 2023, there is a 10% discount code to celebrate the relaunch of the shop. The code will be in the description. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to my favourites of the quarter. So my top 5 fiction. So the first one is Friedrichstrasse 17 by Emma Harding. I've also seen this being called The Berliners on some sites, so I don't know if it's got a different title in different countries, but yeah, it was called Friedrichstrasse 17, and this is an absolute knockout. I think this actually takes #1 spot. This is one of the best books I've read this year. It's about people who, similar actually to the book I've just read for for June TBR, which was These Dividing Walls. It takes place in one building. Well, things happen outside the building, but it's about this one building and the residents who live within it. But these are people from different time periods, so it's people living in the same building, in the same rooms, in different years, building up from the war, or just before the war, so at the turn of the 20th century, so the 1900s, all the way up to relatively present day, and how their lives end up being connected and to the different struggles that they face. And I loved that book. Oh my gosh, did I love that book. I don't understand why that was not nominated for the Women's Prize. It is absolutely phenomenal, and I encourage everyone to go and read it. One of the best books I've ever read. The next one was Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. I read this for one of the TBR Spin prompts, but also because I really wanted to, after having studied war literature and like absurdity, postmodernism, and again, just one of the best books I've ever read. Absolutely loved that. Absolute blinder. I was not expecting the level of comedy, the like dry, sarcastic comedy that came out in it. It was just brilliant. Another one I highly recommend. And then we've got a short story collection. We've got The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Another one that I read because of studying war literature. Not a genre that I would have ever said that I liked. I would have always said that I would avoid war literature. So this one is short stories by a veteran of the Vietnam War, and it's somewhat autobiographical, but he calls it a collection of fictions, so they're not necessarily real. But of course, because it's a lived experience of being in Vietnam, they draw on his experiences. It's a collection of short stories, but they all contain the same characters. So whilst they don't like follow on to each other, there's no progressing storyline. They are all interconnected because of the fact they have the same characters and are about the same alpha company. But yeah, a really good book, really highly, especially if you have read Slaughterhouse 5 and liked it, I would highly recommend that you go on to read The Things They Carried. The next one, I was quite surprised that it actually made it this, like out of all the books I read in the last 3 months, that this made it on, but 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, one of the books I read for my romance reading vlog. I after finishing that, I didn't think any of those would make it onto a favourites list, but actually that particular one, I really did enjoy, and I enjoy some of the other things that it dealt with, some of the themes, and I think that's my big thing is, if I'm going to be reading books, I like there to be other themes, even if it's in the format of a romance, even if it's got that readable, compulsive nature, I like there to be those extra themes. So yeah, if you want to find out more about my views, my romance reading thing is tagged somewhere. And then the final one is Homesick by Jennifer Croft. This is not the only book, but one of the only books I've read from the Women's Prize long list. I don't know whether this made it any further. I don't know if it got shortlisted. I know a lot of people really didn't like this, but I really loved it, and it's made it onto my favourite books of this quarter. It's told almost in vignettes, like some of the chapters are so short, and it's told as these two girls are growing up. So at the beginning, the narrative is quite juvenile, the way things are worded is quite juvenile, but essentially one of the girls ends up having to look after the younger one because her mother is not really capable. She's such a catastrophizer, and then the younger one gets sick, and it becomes about this sibling bond, the sibling relationship, dealing with all of those things. And I just thought it was brilliant. I thought it was really good. I borrowed that one for the library, so that was a library one. Which ones were library ones? Homesick and The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien were library ones. Oh, and Friedrich Strasse 17, so I need to buy those because I want those on my shelves. My top 5 non-fiction. Considering I only read 8 non-fiction, I did actually struggle to build this list. The one that I had no trouble putting on here was The Feminine Middlebrow Novel by Nicola Humble. I feel like I've mentioned this quite a lot. I mentioned it in my romance reading vlog. I read this because I was using it to build my project on I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith for university. I still haven't got my mark yet because there's a marking boycott at the university as like strike action. So I haven't got my mark for that yet, and I'm really gutted. Like, I know I've passed the year. I know I've at least passed. But I put so much effort into that. But anyway, The Feminine Middlebrow Novel by Nicola Humble is looking at novels from the 1920s to the 1950s that were written by women. There were some, like Evelyn Waugh, who was a male writer, but the book Brideshead Revisited does get included into this like category of women's fiction from that period. But it's about books that talk about issues facing women, about, you know, things that concern women, so the family space, relationships, those sorts of things that typically always got marked as less than works by literary figures. So one of Virginia Woolf's books, To the Lighthouse, is considered women's middlebrow fiction, but the rest of hers are all considered literary and highbrow. But essentially the highbrow critics wouldn't allow anything that dealt with the domestic sphere and women's issues to be considered this higher echelon of literature. And so Nicola Humble has gone in and investigated how important these works were, what they did for society, where they fit in society, and it's a really interesting read. I really actually enjoyed reading that, even outside of an academic context. I really learned something about a section of literature that I didn't know anything about before. So that was the one that I was absolutely sure was going on this list. The next one I've put on here is Haiku Love. I can't remember who it's by. It's as part of one of the museum collections. I borrowed this from the library because I wanted to learn a bit more about haiku. The actual haikus themselves, I was not necessarily always a fan of. Some of them were quite sexist because they come from different time periods, and yet they're about, you know, women's bodies and relationships and just speaking in ways that I didn't really like. But what I really found interesting was the introduction. The person who's, I really can't remember their name, the person who wrote the introduction did a really good job of introducing haiku as a poetry type and its evolution and where it is today, people who are using it today, and that was really good. The next one I put on here is Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. This is such a seminal work in gender studies, but it's so difficult to read. It is so dense. That's why I was considering making it an honourable mention instead of a favourite. But as I say, I only read 8 non-fiction, so it's going on because it is such an important work, one that I'm really glad that I have read. But whether I actually feel like I've understood it all, I don't think so, because it's so complexly worded. And I think that's because it's such a difficult thing to understand. these arguments about what sex and gender are and how we can theorize them, whether we should theorize them. And yeah, there's just so much going on. It's really hard to talk about, but I am really glad that I've read it. The next one I'm putting on here is Medieval Women, A Social History of Women from 450 to 1500. This is not necessarily like a fun read. I read this, I've been reading this for quite a while. It's one of those ones that I finished from my my stupidly enormous list of books that I'm currently reading. It was one I just wanted to finish, but I had been teaching myself about medieval England, so this I wanted to understand women's place in society, and I've done quite a bit of learning about the sort of 1400s, 1500s. It's something that we learn a lot at school in the UK, but earlier than that I didn't really know very much about women's place. I would say a lot of the information is quite academic, and I don't think it's like, it doesn't read like an interesting non-fiction book. It reads like an academic one, like you have to be really interested, like I was in that period. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone, but if you're interested in that period and women's place in society in that period, then you might quite enjoy it. Something that I found really interesting that I want to follow up on from reading it is some of the quite erotic literature that came out of religion, and the ways in which women were supposed to be devoted to God and Jesus, and some of the quite erotic nature of that, which I really want to follow up on in those early days of Christianity and stuff. Like some of it's a bit suspect, but. And then the final one, in fact I've got it here, is Zanele Mulholly's All Hail the Dark Lioness, which is a photography collection, but it is also interspersed with writings from different people who have seen the exhibitions. I think people who've been involved in their work. And the reason I don't wholeheartedly put it on my favourites list, that I just sort of, I recognise it as a fantastic collection of work. I recognise Zanele Mulholly as somebody who is really critically thinking about society, wanting to challenge things, but expressing that in the way that they know how, through self-portraiture. The thing I didn't like about the book is that a lot of the extra essays and writings that are in there from other people, not all of them, but many of them, fall into what I consider to be quite, the sorts of wording and the sorts of commentary that puts people off art, the sorts of things that make it sound really snobbish. Yeah, just do you know what I mean? I'm sure you must know what I mean. There's a lot of writing about art and art critiquing that becomes too full of itself, and that really put me off. The stuff where it's really talking about Zanele's intentions and what they were doing and how they were doing it, I found interesting, because it's a social criticism, but some of it just fell into that too snobbish way of talking that I can't get on with. Anyway, so I have 2 honourable mentions from fiction. So one of them is The 5 Sorrowful Mysteries of Andy Africa, which is by Stephen Burrow, who I discovered after finishing the book is from the creative writing course at the university I go to. I really enjoyed that. I found some of it a little bit difficult, but it's about Andy Africa, who lives in Africa but wants to escape because of the tensions between Muslims and Christians where he lives, but also his obsessions with white skin and white-skinned women, which was a very interesting mix of things going on. I read that as an arc, so that was my one arc that ended up in my favourites list. And then the other one is the short story collection How Long Till Black Futures Month by N.K. Jemisin. I've never read anything else by N.K. Jemisin. I have 2 books on my shelves by her. As a short story collection, of course there are going to be some that I didn't like, but overall I thought the collection was excellent. There were so many in there that I really loved. I listened to this on audio. I don't really get on with short stories on audio, but I would really like to own this one. So, after all that, it's now time to talk about whether I'm keeping up with my reading goals. The first goal I set was to read more from other ethnicities. I originally said I wanted to read more from people of colour, but I feel like that doesn't quite... It's a really hard thing to chart, and what do you consider under people of colour? I think just saying people of other ethnicities, because some people might identify as white, but I might feel like their lived experience is sufficiently different to mine based on where they live in the world that I would like to include them in this. So I'm changing the title of the goal to read more from other ethnicities. Okay, I hope that Okay. So my aim with this goal when I set it at the beginning of this year was to read at least one per month from somebody else, just to make sure I was actively putting other ethnicities into my reading. Because just by the nature of publishing, it can be so easy to end up with an all-white reading list. So I've actually smashed it, but I've read 11 books plus a short story collection, which is from various authors and therefore included some of different ethnicities. Yeah, 11 when I meant to read 3. Or 12 when I meant to read 3. And I DNFed 1 book under this goal. So yeah, I think it's fair to say I'm smashing that one. Would you like a video where I talk about all those books? I think I've already said I was going to do one in October when it's Black History Month in the UK. That's when I'm going to do it. I'll tell you all about the books I've read in October. So, number 2, read more short story collections. There was no number attached to this. I didn't set a 1 per month, but I just wanted to make sure that by the end of the year I had more than, say, 3 short story collections under my belt. But I have read in this quarter The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, which I listed in my favourites from this month. Anonymous Sex, which is by various authors, and whilst there is a list of all the authors that were included in the book, each of the stories is anonymous, so you don't know which author wrote which ones. Obviously you can guess if you want to, but nobody knows. And that was a very interesting collection of stories. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know I'm quite interested in this idea of writing about the erotic and the different types of what the erotic is. So in that short story collections, there were some that you would say were quite traditional romance type erotic writing, and then some where they were exploring, say, teenage emotions and how weird the erotic is when you are a teenager. And yeah, there was all sorts of different explorations of it. So some people didn't like it because I think they wanted it all to be very romantic, but I thought it was a great collection. The third one was Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. It's one of those things where I want to have read the classics. I want to know the classics just so that I can better understand some of the literature that I read that is based on the classic mythology, but I didn't necessarily enjoy the stories from Norse mythology. And then How Long Till Black Futures Month by N.K. Jemisin, which I mentioned in my honourable mentions. So then goal 3 was to read more poetry. It seems that in this quarter I have mostly focused on haiku, so Haiku Love, which I mentioned in my favourites, and also one called Clear Love by Alan Spence, who is a modern poet who likes to work within the haiku format, who I believe is in Glasgow, and so many of his poems are about Scotland rather than about Asian landscapes, but it's a very nice collection. I thought I loved that one. Goal 4, embark on my rereading journey. So this one I didn't get quite as far through as I had hoped. I started Far From the Madding Crowd. I had to put it down to one side because of university, and I just wasn't really feeling that engaged in it. I did a lot of pre-research. So I did I read Thomas Hardy's poetry collection back in the last quarter. I read some essays. I did a bit of research because I started using some of the introductory. In the edition that I had, there's a nice big introduction that really talks about Hardy's work, Hardy's life, and this particular book, how it was serialised in a Cornhill magazine. And then I used that to go and do a bit more research. So I did a lot of research, but I didn't feel compelled to start reading it until more recently. So I'm now about a third of the way into it. So I haven't finished a book in this quarter, which I was a bit gutted about, but it's fine. It's fine, but I'm in the middle of the vlog. It will be coming soon. And then the final goal was to read more translated work. And I am pretty gutted to say that I haven't read any in this 3 months. Yeah. Pretty gutted about that. I am technically in the middle of 3 non-fictions that are translated, but I haven't made much progress in any of those. I have now started for TBR Spin The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is translated. But I had last month actually picked out a few translated works that I would quite like to read in August for Women in Translation Month. I may be doing much better next quarter. Do I have any plans for the next 3 months? Other than the translated fiction, I am off uni for the next 3 months, pretty much. 3 months? Well, it's gone down now. July, Yeah, July, August, September. Yeah, I'm off basically, all of that. Off. I'm a parent, I have various commitments. I'm not off, but I should at least be able to do a bit more reading. For my next reread after I finished Far From the Madding Crowd, I'm hoping to do Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. It's another one that has sort of crept into some of my research for other projects I've been doing. It falls into this idea of erotic literature that I am very interested in, but I'm really in the mood at the moment for memoir and biography and like that sort of non-fiction, so you may find that features quite heavily on my reading list. So thanks for watching, guys. See you in the next one.